Have you ever woken up in the middle of the night with that unsettling feeling that something fundamental is shifting around you, but you can't quite identify what it is? It's as if you're on a train that has begun to change direction so subtly that only your body notices, while your conscious mind has yet to register the turn. This is precisely the situation we find ourselves in today as a species. We are living not merely through another era of change, but through a change of era so profound that our minds, shaped by millennia of evolution to detect immediate and tangible threats, can barely comprehend its magnitude. What is happening now is not just another chapter in human history, but potentially the beginning of an entirely new story, one in which the very meaning of being human is being redefined before our eyes. And the most extraordinary part is that, unlike every major transformation of our past, this one is happening consciously and largely by our own hands. To truly understand the extraordinary moment we are living in, we must look back at the arc of our journey as a species. For hundreds of thousands of years, Homo sapiens lived in a world where change was extremely slow. A hunter-gatherer who lived 70,000 years ago would have had skills and knowledge very similar to those of his ancestors 100,000 years earlier. Tools, beliefs, and social structures evolved at a pace that was almost imperceptible within a single lifetime. Our ancestors were born, lived, and died in worlds that remained essentially the same. This was the environment in which our psychology evolved, where our fears, desires, intuitions, and cognitive capacities were shaped. We evolved to thrive in a world of relative constancy, where understanding the past was a reliable guide for navigating the future. Then, about 12,000 years ago, the agricultural revolution occurred, the first great conscious transformation we imposed on our way of life. We stopped being nomads, following the natural flow of the seasons and the movements of animals, and we began to settle in one place, actively manipulating our surroundings. We started to domesticate plants and animals to create food surpluses, to build cities, and thus increasingly complex and hierarchical societies. This transformation profoundly altered not only how we lived materially, but also how we organized ourselves socially and how we conceived our relationship with the natural world and with time itself. Yet even after the agricultural revolution, the life of an ordinary peasant in 1700 would not have been radically different from that of a peasant in 500 BCE. The basic technologies for plowing the land, building shelters, treating illnesses, and educating children remained remarkably stable for millennia. The next great acceleration came with the Industrial Revolution, which began in the 18th century and intensified in the 19th. For the first time, the pace of technological and social change became noticeable within an individual's lifetime. Someone born in 1760 could, in old age, see steam locomotives crossing landscapes that in childhood were traveled only by horses and wagons. Mass production, rapid urbanization, new forms of energy, all of this radically transformed the social fabric and humanity's relationship with time and space. Yet, even with all these changes, the foundations of what it meant to be human remained relatively stable. We still were born, grew, learned, worked, formed families, aged, and died in recognizable cycles, even if the settings of those cycles were changing rapidly. Now, we stand at the threshold of a transformation qualitatively different from anything we have ever experienced. We are not merely changing our external environment or our technologies, we are beginning to intervene directly in the fundamental processes that define what we are as a species. The convergence of revolutions in biotechnology, nanotechnology, computer science, and especially artificial intelligence is creating possibilities that would have seemed like pure science fiction just a generation ago. We are gaining the power to redesign our bodies, extend our cognitive abilities, create intelligent non-human entities, and potentially transcend many of the biological limitations that have always defined the human condition. Think of genetic editing through CRISPR technology, which already allows us to modify human DNA with unprecedented precision. In a few years, we may not only eliminate devastating genetic diseases, but also potentially select and enhance desirable traits in our children. Think of brain-machine interfaces being developed technologies that will allow increasingly deep integration between our minds and external devices, radically expanding our cognitive capacities. Think of longevity research that could, in the coming decades, significantly extend human life, perhaps even pave the way toward a form of practical immortality. And perhaps most transformative of all, think of the accelerated development of artificial intelligence, which is creating entities whose abilities in some dimensions already surpass our own. It is easy to talk about these technologies in abstract terms as mere tools that we can choose to use or not according to our convenience. But that is a profoundly inadequate understanding of what is truly happening. These are not just new tools, but transformational technologies with the potential to fundamentally redefine what it means to be human. Historically, we have always understood ourselves in contrast to the world around us. We were the only beings capable of complex symbolic language, long-term planning, artistic creation, ethical reflection, and advanced engineering. Our identity as a species was intimately tied to these unique capacities. But what happens when we create machines that can do all these things as well as we can, or even better? What happens to our self-understanding when the boundaries between human and non-human, between natural and artificial, between born and created, begin to dissolve? These questions are not merely philosophical or theoretical. They have deeply practical implications for how we will organize our societies in the coming decades. Consider the impact of automation and artificial intelligence on human labor. For millennia, work has been central not only to our material survival, but also to our identity, our sense of purpose, our social standing. Now we face the prospect of a world where an increasing share of traditional labor can be performed more efficiently by machines. Some foresee a utopian future of abundance and leisure where humans are freed from the need to work for subsistence and can dedicate themselves to higher pursuits of personal growth and creative expression. Others fear a dystopian future of extreme inequality, where those who control new technologies accumulate unprecedented wealth and power, while the majority become economically redundant, dependent on some form of universal basic income to survive. Whichever scenario materializes, it is clear we will need to fundamentally rethink our economic and social structures. The systems we developed over the past centuries, from industrial capitalism to the welfare state, were designed for a world in which human labor was the primary factor of production. What happens when that is no longer the case? How do we distribute the fruits of an increasingly automated economy? How do we find meaning and purpose in a world where traditional work is no longer available to many? These are questions that demand not just incremental policy adjustments, but potentially a complete reinvention of how we structure our societies or consider the implications of advanced biotechnology. As we gain greater control over our bodies and genomes, we will face profoundly challenging choices. Who will have access to human enhancement technologies? Will only the wealthy be able to afford to genetically improve their children, creating a new form of biological inequality that perpetuates itself across generations? Or will we find ways to democratize these technologies, making them accessible to all? And how do we collectively decide which types of modifications are acceptable? Where do we draw the line between curing diseases and enhancing normal capabilities? Who has the right to make these transformative decisions on behalf of future generations? I need to pause for a moment and ask you directly, which aspect of this technological future we are discussing most awakens your fear or apprehension? Do you lie awake at night thinking about it too? I know that many of us keep these worries to ourselves, perhaps afraid of seeming paranoid or technophobic in a world that celebrates every new innovation without question. But your concerns are valid and likely shared by far more people than you might imagine. Share in the comments, my greatest fear about our technological future is. Your voice can help create a space where we can honestly discuss these collective fears instead of suppressing them. And perhaps by naming these fears together, we can begin to imagine ways to face them. And perhaps the deepest revolution of all is that of artificial intelligence. For the first time in history, we are creating entities that could, in principle, surpass our cognitive capacities in virtually every domain. The development of general artificial intelligence systems that can learn and perform any intellectual task a human can represents an unprecedented turning point. Historically, humanity's privileged position in the world was anchored in our superior intelligence. We were the only beings capable of creating sophisticated tools, developing science and technology, and philosophically reflecting on our own existence. But what happens when we are no longer the most intelligent beings on the planet? What happens to our self-understanding when confronted with entities that can think faster, deeper, and with more information than we ever could? This is not a merely theoretical question. In recent years, we have witnessed remarkable advances in artificial intelligence. AI systems have already surpassed humans in complex strategy games like chess and Go, are learning to drive vehicles, diagnose diseases, create art and music, and write increasingly sophisticated texts. We are only at the beginning of this trajectory, and the pace of progress is accelerating. If we continue along this path, it is plausible that in the coming decades, we will develop artificial intelligence systems that are genuinely autonomous and self-aware, capable not only of performing specific tasks, but of setting their own goals and reflecting on their own existence. This places us before profound existential questions. What will the relationship between humans and advanced artificial intelligences be? Will we be partners, competitors, creators, and creations, or something entirely new? What rights and moral considerations should we extend to self-aware artificial entities. How do we ensure that advanced AI systems remain aligned with fundamental human values, especially if they become capable of redesigning and improving themselves in an accelerated evolutionary process that could quickly surpass our understanding? And perhaps most unsettling, what happens to the role of humans in a world where we are no longer the only or even the primary intelligent agents? Throughout our entire history, we have built our civilizations, cultures, power structures, and self-understanding on the premise that we were the only beings capable of abstract thought, long-term planning, aesthetic creation, and moral deliberation. What happens when that premise is no longer valid? These questions may seem distant or speculative, but the speed of technological advances suggests that we may have to face them much sooner than most of us imagine. The development of artificial intelligence is not following a linear progression, but an exponential one. What seemed like distant science fiction just a decade ago is rapidly becoming reality. And once we create genuinely autonomous AI systems capable of continuously improving themselves, the pace of change may accelerate even further, leading to transformations that are literally unpredictable to our limited human minds. This is a crucial point we must understand. We are entering uncharted territory, not only in practical terms, but in cognitive terms. Our minds evolved to deal with a specific set of challenges in relatively simple and stable environments. We struggle to truly grasp exponential processes, to visualize the long-term implications of transformational technologies, to imagine ways of being that are radically different from our human experience. That is why we often respond to these future possibilities with either naive optimism or apocalyptic fear, failing to develop a more nuanced understanding of the real possibilities and risks. And here we reach a fundamental paradox of our current condition. We are developing technologies that have the potential to radically transform what it means to be human, yet we are doing so with minds that are still, for the most part, the same ones that evolved on the African savannas hundreds of thousands of years ago. Our instincts, intuitions, and cognitive capacities were shaped for a world radically different from the one we are creating. We have 21st century tools, but Stone Age minds, and that discrepancy creates deep challenges for our ability to wisely navigate the future we are building. Consider how we instinctively respond to threats. Our biological alarm system was designed to react to immediate, tangible dangers: predators, human enemies, natural disasters. When confronted with a tiger, our bodies instantly enter fight or flight mode, mobilizing resources to face the immediate threat. This system worked beautifully for the environment in which we evolved, but it is poorly suited for the kinds of existential threats we now face. Risks such as climate change, nuclear war, or misaligned AI do not trigger our alarm systems in the same way because they are abstract, gradual, or probabilistic. As a result, we tend not to react with appropriate urgency, even when these threats pose far greater risks to our well-being and survival than any tiger ever did. Or consider how we form our identities. Evolutionarily, we defined ourselves primarily through our tribes, the small groups of 50 to 150 people with whom we interacted directly. Our moral psychology, our instincts for cooperation, our need for belonging, all were shaped by this original tribal context. Even as we build much larger societies, we tend to recreate tribal structures, dividing the world into us and them, projecting loyalty onto nations, religions, ideologies, or other markers of group identity. But the technologies we are now developing create challenges that are fundamentally global, that transcend all tribal and national boundaries. Our tribal psychology may be a critical obstacle to the global cooperation required to wisely navigate the risks and opportunities of transformational technologies. This is, perhaps, the most fundamental challenge we face: how to transcend the limitations of our evolved minds in order to wisely deal with technologies that have the potential to transform or even transcend our humanity. How do we develop the wisdom required to navigate a future that may be so different from the past that our traditional intuitions and heuristics become not only useless, but potentially dangerous? I have no simple answers to these questions, and I suspect no one does. We are collectively sailing in uncharted waters, and there are no reliable maps to guide us. But that does not mean we are completely disoriented. We can identify some promising directions, some lights that can help illuminate our path forward. First, we need to cultivate a deeper awareness of the limitations of our minds. Research in cognitive psychology, behavioral economics, and neuroscience over the past few decades has extensively mapped the biases and heuristics that shape our thinking, often in ways we do not consciously perceive. Understanding these cognitive patterns is not just an academic exercise, it is a practical tool for making better decisions. When we know that, we tend to overfocus on vivid, immediate risks while neglecting abstract or gradual threats. We can consciously correct that bias in our judgments. When we recognize our propensity for tribal thinking, we can actively work to expand our circle of moral concern. Second, we need to develop institutions and decision-making processes that compensate for our individual cognitive limitations. Our individual minds may be fallible, but collectively we can create systems that are wiser than any single person. This requires not only robust democratic institutions, but new forms of governance capable of effectively addressing global and long-term challenges. We need mechanisms that give voice to the interests of future generations, that facilitate global cooperation on existential issues, that integrate diverse perspectives into our decision-making processes. Third, and perhaps most importantly, we need to cultivate a new understanding of what it means to be human in this era of accelerated technological transformation. Throughout history, our sense of identity and purpose has been shaped by the limitations of our biological condition. We were finite beings with limited capacities, struggling to survive and thrive in a world often hostile to our existence. Now we face the possibility of transcending many of those limitations. We may potentially live much longer, think much more clearly, experience forms of being that our ancestors could scarcely imagine. But with these possibilities come deep questions. What do we wish to preserve of our current humanity as we embrace these new capabilities? Which values, relationships, and experiences are so fundamental to what we cherish about being human that we want to safeguard them even as we transcend our current biological limits? This last question, I believe, is the most fundamental of all. The technologies we are developing are not neutral. They embody values, priorities, worldviews. The decisions we make about how to develop and implement these technologies will reflect and in turn shape our understanding of what is important, what is valuable, what it means to live a good life. This is not a process that will happen automatically. It requires conscious reflection, open dialogue, deep engagement with the traditions of wisdom that humanity has cultivated over millennia, along with a willingness to radically rethink assumptions that once seemed immutable. One thing is certain: the future is not predetermined. Despite the astonishing pace of technological progress, we still have meaningful choices about how to develop and implement these transformational technologies. We can still collectively shape the world we are creating, but to do so effectively, we must recognize the magnitude of the transformation underway, confront honestly the existential questions it raises, and develop the collective wisdom required to navigate this uncharted territory. I do not claim to have all the answers. No one does. But by clearly naming the challenges we face, by consciously reflecting on the values we wish to preserve and promote as we move through this unknown terrain, we can at least begin to formulate the right questions. And perhaps by doing so together as a global community, engaged in open dialogue about our shared future, we may find a path that allows us to embrace the transformative possibilities of new technologies while preserving what is most precious in our humanity. The future will be what we make of it. And despite all uncertainties, I believe we still have the capacity to create a future that reflects the best of our humanity, that expands our capabilities without sacrificing what makes us truly human. But that will not happen automatically. It requires that we be conscious, intentional, collectively engaged in the task of shaping the technologies that in turn are reshaping us. It requires that we not be merely passive objects of technological change, but active agents in determining its direction and meaning, returning to the feeling we began with that awakening in the middle of the night, accompanied by the faint realization that something fundamental is changing. Now we can name that sensation more clearly. We are living in a moment of historical transition where the very meaning of being human is being redefined. This is not merely another era of change, but a change of era, perhaps the deepest in the history of our species. And although that may seem frightening, it is also an unprecedented opportunity. For the first time, we have the chance to consciously participate in redefining what it means to be human, to actively shape our future evolution, rather than merely being objects of blind evolutionary forces. What choices will we make with this extraordinary opportunity? What kind of future will we create together? These are the questions that define our age, and the answers we find together will determine not only the course of our individual lives, but potentially the future of all conscious life that originated on this small planet. If these reflections have touched something you've been feeling, but perhaps hadn't yet found the words to express, know that you are not alone. By subscribing to the channel, you will connect with a growing community of people who share your concerns and your desire for a deeper understanding of the philosophical challenges of our time. Each week, we gather here to explore together the great questions that define our era and to seek not only understanding, but also wiser ways of living amid the transformations we are witnessing, This is not just a channel, it is a space for dialogue and collective growth. Join us on this ongoing journey. Subscribe so we can continue this essential conversation about how to live with greater wisdom and purpose in a world that often leaves us disoriented and divided.
Of people, if they're watching this video, it was recommended to them by an algorithm.
Algorithms now are extremely powerful. They increasingly control us. I'm now publishing a book. I'm on a book tour. My number one client is not a human being, it's the algorithm. If I can get the algorithm to recommend my book, that's it. My job is done. The humans will follow the algorithm. We need these algorithms, otherwise we can't manage these huge information network without algorithmic help. They should be accountable. If a social media algorithm recommends to people a hate-filled conspiracy theory, this is the fault not of the person who produced the conspiracy theory. It's the fault of the people who designed and let loose the algorithm. There is this huge debate about freedom of speech. I think we should be extremely careful about censoring the free speech of human beings. But they should be held accountable for the decisions of their algorithms. And algorithms don't have freedom of speech. It's the first time in history that there is something which is not a human being that decides which stories to spread and that can create new stories.
Information is the food of the mind. More information is always good for you. That's ridiculous.
You think a lot about these topics, and how do you protect yourself against the negative consequences of AI?
There are two main things. One is to get to know my own mind as well as I can. Because all these manipulations, they work by getting to know and exploit our own weaknesses. It's the oldest advice in the book. Get to know yourself better. The second thing is to keep some kind of an information diet. Lots of people have a food diet. They are very mindful of what they eat, which is important. You don't want to eat too much, it's not good for you. You don't want to eat junk food, it's not good for you. It's the same with information. Information is the food of the mind. The idea that more information is always good for you, that's ridiculous. It's like thinking that more food is always good for you. Not true. And similarly, you have to be very mindful what kind of information you're putting into your mind. If you feed your mind constantly with outrage and anger and fear, you'll get a sick mind. So you have to be very careful. Also very important, like with food, you need time to digest. Time when you don't take in more information. That's it for now, and now I need to digest.
I don't think it's possible to predict the future, but thinking about the future makes it possible to reflect on the meaning of what is happening right now, of the choices, the decisions we make right now, because many of these choices will have an effect for decades, maybe centuries to come. The present cannot be understood separately from the past, but neither can be understood separately from the future.